What's up, Internet? This is Rambling Josh, and today I want to talk a little bit about the Super Nintendo Classic, Mini, whatever you want to call it. It came out this past week, and a lot of people are talking about it. I know some people are talking again about what games are and are not on the console. And so I thought it'd be kind of interesting to give my take on it a little bit, in kind of like my own way sort of thing. So originally I was just going to list out a whole bunch of games and say that if I was making the SNES Classic, this is what I would put on it. But I kind of came to the realization that probably about 60 to 70% of that list would actually just be the same as what is actually on the console already. So many of the games that are on there are what I would call like super classics. There are those games that like everybody has to try at least once. There are those games that like they're just super solid. They're the games that people grew up with. They're the games that to this day in 2017 still kind of influence modern day developers. They inform our modern design because these are the games that are just so well loved, right? So rather than go through those games again, I kind of figured, okay, what if I took 10 games off of the current SNES Classic and I put 10 games on to kind of make it a like, this is what my SNES Classic would look like. This is not even necessarily like my favorite games or what I think are the best games. It's some combination, like it's basically what are the games that I would be most likely to play if this theoretical SNES Classic existed, through some combination of like game quality and nostalgia and recency bias and all this kind of stuff. And also, the astute among you may be aware that there are actually 21 games on the SNES Classic, so for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to straight off cut Star Fox 2, because technically that's actually a new release. So by doing that, it kind of takes that out of the equation, and it also makes it so that there's an even 20 games on the console. 10 from Nintendo and 10 of my choosing. So to start off with, here are all of the games that are on the console by default. All great games, but we have to cut 10 of them. So I'm not going to talk too much about why I chose to cut the ones that I did, but basically it comes down to they're games that I didn't have a lot of experience with as a kid, so I don't really have much nostalgia for them, or they're just not really my kind of game. Or in some instances, like Super Punch-Out, I feel like I feel like the original Punch-Out is more classic than the Super Punch-Out, kind of this kind of idea. So anyways, the 10 games that I'm going to be leaving on after the cut are Final Fantasy VI, Link to the Past, Mega Man X, Secret of Mana, Mario RPG, Mario World, Yoshi's Island, Super Metroid, Earthbound, and Super Castlevania 4. Although I will say that when I was choosing which games to cut, it was very, very close between Donkey Kong Country and Castlevania 4. And basically what it came down to is that I'm just a bigger Castlevania fan. Donkey Kong Country is a really, really, really outstanding series, but it's also not one that I've invested a lot of like significant time in myself. So Super Castlevania 4 just kind of hits closer to my own personal tastes, which is the point of this whole experiment anyways. So that being said, now let's jump into the 10 games that I would add to bring this back up to an even 20. First off, we have Chrono Trigger, which honestly, like I'm sure many people are astounded that this game is not on the console to begin with. You know, I mentioned how basically all of the games that are on the SNES Classic already are, you know, the super classics. How could they not be on there? These games are like the cream of the crop kind of thing. And Chrono Trigger is like 100% in that category of game. So it's a little bit of a head scratcher as to why Chrono Trigger is not in there. One assumes it's because they didn't want to have too many RPGs on the console, but whatever. Screw it. My version of the console, I'm going to have Chrono Trigger on it. I've never even played the Super Nintendo version of Chrono Trigger. It's just, Chrono Trigger is just an amazing game. This is a very well-known fact. I think it's probably very much in contention for like the most famous Super Nintendo title that there is. So God only knows why it was not on the console, but now it is, sort of. Game number 2 on the Rambling Josh version of the SNES Classic is Soul Blazer. If you don't know what Soul Blazer is, it's one of, you could almost call it like a trilogy of games by a company called Quintet. So on the Super Nintendo, they made 3 games that are all kind of about like regenerating Earth, so to speak. And they're kind of like a soft trilogy. They're vaguely related to each other. You can kind of draw certain threads between the 3 games, but those are. It starts with Soul Blazer. I think it starts there. And then it goes to Illusion of Gaia. And then the 3rd game is Terranigma, which is a game that was never actually released in North America. It was a PAL-only release, and probably Japan. But yeah, so we didn't get Terranigma in North America. So that's kind of unfortunate. Terranigma is actually a very, very good game. All 3 of them are great games. I would say that Terranigma is probably the best of the 3, but to me, Soul Blazer will always be the one that kind of like, it's the game that's in my heart. I discovered it entirely by accident when I was a kid, and something about that game just really kind of struck me. It's a very simple game. It doesn't have a lot of like complicated plot or like complex puzzles or any of this kind of stuff. It's just very simple. You're going into the dungeon, you're rescuing people to like regenerate the world, you're rebuilding all these villages, and to me that's really satisfying to kind of see the fruits of your labor be like you're literally regenerating the world around you. And it's just a really cool game. It's got really great music, and it's one of those games that I can always go back to and just kind of jump in and just kind of plow through in like a day kind of idea. Number 3 on the list is Breath of Fire 2, a game that I'm actually playing like right now. I don't know, you probably can't see this. Obviously this is the Game Boy Advance version of the game, which I play exclusively now because it's got certain improvements over the SNES version, but Breath of Fire 2 is one of those games that was like super, super, super formative to me. I played it when I was very young. It was potentially my first ever RPG. My brain's always a little hazy as to whether that or Final Fantasy IV was first. Final Fantasy 2, whatever. But Breath of Fire 2 is, like I said, it's one of those games that like it pulled me into the JRPG genre. It's got this kind of like legacy in my heart that it's one of those kind of like taste-defining games that has kind of stuck with me for my entire life. It's just super high quality, super charming, super good soundtrack. I can just jump into that game and start playing it at any time, at any point in my life, and I will never regret that decision. Like I said, I'm literally replaying it right now. Like, as soon as I'm done recording this video, I'm gonna go start doing the laundry and I'm gonna play Breath of Fire 2 on my Game Boy Advance while I'm waiting for my clothes to dry, kind of idea. So obviously there's a little bit of recency bias with that as well, but it's just a game that's just so near and dear to my heart. And after that, we have The Lost Vikings, which is kind of an interesting game because it's one of the first games actually by Blizzard Entertainment. It was so early on, in fact, that they were not even called Blizzard at that point. They were still called Silicon and Synapse. And it's just a really neat little kind of, I guess you could call it a puzzle platformer. It's like a team-based puzzle platformer. I don't know. It's a little bit hard to describe. It's almost like Trine, if you've played Trine. Or Trine is like The Lost Vikings, I guess. And again, it's just another game that's just chock full of charm. It's super polished. It's just one of those games that sticks with you, and it's a game that I have a lot of nostalgia for because I remember playing this when I was a very wee lad, and it's one of those games that just sticks with you. It's very timeless. You can always just jump into it and play it. One thing that people may not know about The Lost Vikings is that they actually made a sequel to it as well, called The Lost Vikings 2, which is actually also a very good game. They added a couple new characters to it. It really kind of plays with the formula a little bit. It's really, really solid. It doesn't have as much nostalgia for me, so whatever. And what even fewer people may know is there's actually a remake of Lost Vikings 2, which I think was done by a third party and published by Blizzard or something like that. And it's on the PlayStation 1, and it's called North by Northwest, which is just a really great name. And that name is basically the entire reason I'm on this little history lesson, or whatever you want to call it. So anyways, Lost Vikings, really great game. If you haven't played it, you really should. It's really good. Following that, we have Final Fantasy IV, which, like I said, is kind of almost neck and neck with Breath of Fire 2 as far as kind of like my introduction to JRPGs and defining my taste as a gamer going forward. It's one of those games that I just saw on a shelf one day and I thought like, oh hey, there's a little knight running around a castle on the back of the box, and I like knights, and there's like I like swords, and the like T on the front of the box is shaped like a sword, and that's real cool. And I just rented that game, and that was the start of it. Final Fantasy was like my life from there going forward. It's actually kind of a funny game, really, because I've kind of said for pretty much all of the games that I've included so far that it's a really good game, it's really polished, or it's what this or that. And the thing about Final Fantasy IV is that I almost consider this to be like one of the like definitive games that fall into those categories, because the thing about it is, if you think about it, it's actually one of the most simplistic Final Fantasy games in the entire series. You know, there aren't really any complicated like decisions that you can make in the game. It's pretty linear. Like you can't even choose your party. Like you don't have very many like super special abilities or anything like that. You don't have like fancy accessories. There aren't like a whole lot of like super complicated like equipment decisions to be made. It's a super streamlined game. And yet it's one of those games that people just love it. The presentation of this game is just so top tier that like if it pulls you in, then like it's got you. It's one of those games that you're gonna remember for your entire life. And yeah, so it's definitely one of those games for me. So Final Fantasy IV. Number 6 on the list is Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which is a little bit of an odd inclusion here. And like pretty much everything on this game is kind of like some kind of, you can kind of tell it's a little bit JRPG-ish, or it's got that kind of feel to it. And then you have Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And this is just, I don't want to say it's pure nostalgia, because it is actually like a pretty legit game. But my reasons for including this on the list are pretty much entirely down to like, I was a huge Power Rangers fan for quite a few years as a kid, as was everybody my age at the time. So like, this is like the 90s pick. I remember I got this game around the time when the Power Rangers movie came out. They had this big promotion going on at my local video game store. They had like someone was like dressed up in a Power Rangers costume, and they were like signing autographs or something like that. And they had this big sale going on, and one of the games that was on sale was Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which to note is not the Power Rangers movie game, although they're both like side-scrolling beat-em-ups. This is Mighty Morphin Power Ranger. Like I said, it's pretty much, you know, a pretty simple beat 'em up, but it's one of those games that like I had every inch of that game memorized when I was a kid. I could just sit down and play it and just play through the whole thing in like an hour kind of thing. And I was one of those kids who would like, after the end credits, they give you these like 2 little cheat codes, and you can use those to go into this like versus mode where you can fight against other people using the Megazords. And like the other person fights using one of the like giant Power Rangers monster things. So I would like sit there and practice and like learn how to like do like special moves and stuff like that. And like, oh, the AI monster can do this attack. How do I do that attack? And it's just, I've spent so much time playing that game as a kid that like it earned its way into my heart, even though it's not really the kind of game that I usually get attached to. But just the branding of this game, just it sold it for me. And speaking of games you may not expect to be on this list, next up is Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which, let me just get this out of the way, okay? Mystic Quest is a fucking amazing video game, and if you disagree, then you have questionable tastes. That's my hot take. I know that Mystic Quest gets a bit of a bad rap, and obviously it's a pretty simplified RPG experience, but it's just such a quality game. Like, the experience of playing this game is just, in my opinion, it's so top tier. Like, the battles are like quick and snappy. The music is amazing. So good. Listen to Red Cap Assault and tell me that this game is not amazing. I think it's probably the first RPG I ever played where you can choose to not engage in battles if you don't want to. Obviously, there's a lot of them that are along the path that you can't avoid, but like the monsters are there on the map. That was like unheard of at the time. Probably, for me at least, when I was 8. I don't know. I just love this game. I'm not gonna apologize for it. It's so good, and I don't understand why it gets such a bad rap. I kind of understand, but like, I don't know, man. It's so fun. Speaking of games that are fun, one that kind of isn't that fun, we have J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings Volume 1, which is quite the title, and I'm sure most people probably have no idea that this game exists. But this is one of those games that I ended up playing a lot of this when I was a kid. It's, a pretty consistent theme throughout these games. And I'm gonna be honest, it's not that good a game. My love for this game is almost entirely through nostalgia. I will say that the soundtrack to this game is really freaking good. You should go listen to it if you ever want something kind of like just chill to play in the background. But yeah, this is one of those games. It was a big part of my childhood. I played it a lot. I played it with my dad. This is not a good co-op game. Technically, it's designed to be played with, I think, 8 players. And anyone who is not controlled by a human player is basically useless, but whatever. It's an interesting experience. I really loved Lord of the Rings as a kid. I still really love Lord of the Rings. And this is one of those games that, like, as much as I recognize that it's not very good, I look back on it very fondly. And also, some fun facts. Volume 2 was never released because Volume 1 performed so poorly that they couldn't fund it. And also, there's another game with the exact same title, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings Volume 1, which was on, I guess it was like a DOS game? Whatever, computers back then were kind of confusing. But yeah, there was a PC version of this game, which is like a completely different game. It's just a pure RPG, as far as I understand it. And funnily enough, the Amiga port of that game was also made by Silicon and Synapse. And now, bringing the rotation of like JRPG and not JRPG to its conclusion, we have Dragon Quest V, which is an interesting inclusion on this list for a few reasons. First of all, obviously, this is a game that never got an English release on the Super Nintendo. Obviously, we have a DS version of it now, and there are translation patches of the Super Nintendo version, but I include this on this list just because Dragon Quest V, to me, is just such a good game. I personally originally played it using a translation patch of the Super Nintendo version. And it was actually somewhat recently. I think this was probably, 5 years ago, 6 years ago at this point. I guess that's not that recent, but compared to the rest of the games on this list that are like, yeah, this was a game from my childhood, I remember it so fondly, and I've got so much nostalgia, Dragon Quest V is actually a game that I played in recent times, in modern days, and it became one of my favorite games on the console. So if you're not familiar with Dragon Quest V, the whole concept of the game is, it takes place over kind of like the entire lifespan of the protagonist's lifespan. You start off as a kid, you grow up, you get a wife, make some babies, go adventuring with your babies. They're not babies when you're adventuring, they're children, but whatever. You all this stuff. There's all this kind of there's drama, there's intrigue, and I don't know. It's just a really interesting experience, and it's an experience that's constantly changing, and it's just a really interesting game. And I typically think of it as kind of, I guess I would probably put it as my second favorite game in the series, though I still haven't put much time into Dragon Quest VII. Just don't tell anybody that. But yeah, anyways, it's just such a good game that, like, even though I think it's probably cheating a little bit to put it on this list. In my ideal world where this version of the SNES Classic exists, I would love to see a Dragon Quest V, like an official release of Dragon Quest V Super Nintendo with an English translation. And then finally, the last game on this list is a game that I didn't even know the correct name for it until yesterday, is Ultima Runes of Virtue 2, which most likely is probably another game that you didn't know existed, but that's okay. I knew it existed. I played this game a lot as a kid. I watched my dad play it a lot as a kid because I was too young to even appreciate what was going on, but it's just one of those games that the style of it just captivated me when I was a kid. And by modern standards, it's not very good. Like, well, I don't know. I'm not sure if I would even say it's not very good. The main problem with the game is that it's very cryptic, and to some degree, I think there's some people that would probably really appreciate that in an age where games are all about, like, holding your hands, right? So the whole thing with this game is that the Runes of Virtue games they're basically meant to be kind of like Ultima's answer to Zelda. They're kind of like an attempt to make a Zelda-like game. So the first game was released on the Game Boy, and the second game, I think, was released on the Game Boy and the Super Nintendo or something. I don't know. That whole deal is really confusing. The whole, like, for my entire life, I thought this game was just called Runes of Virtue, but it's actually Runes of Virtue 2, because the first one was not on the Super Nintendo, but I don't know. It's confusing, but this game really stands out to me as one of those games that, like, has I have a really personal connection to, much like pretty much all of the games on this list. And so, like, putting together a list of 10 games, it's one, like, I kind of have to include it. It's a really jank game, and it's got a lot of problems, but it's not that bad. Like, you know, I was playing it a little bit at around the new year. And, you know, I was having a good time. It's a little overly cryptic, like I said, but, you know, it gets you thinking. It's got a lot of mysteries, and those mysteries are fun to unravel. It's almost like if you take something like Link to the Past and you just make it a much more puzzle-based game and a much less action-based game. Because the action in Runes of Virtue is very weak. But everything else is, you know, fairly strong. And also, an interesting point is the fact that I think Runes of Virtue takes place in the same world as Ultima. Is it Ultima 6, The False Prophet? I think that's Ultima 6, yeah. It's the only other Ultima game that I really know. But yeah, so that's kind of cool, because being as I know both games, it's kind of like you can draw parallels and stuff like that. But anyways, there's my final list of all 20 games I would have on my personalized version of the SNES Mini. Obviously not all of the games that I've chosen for my 10 are super solid games, or they're not all super well-known games. Some of them are actually kind of bad games, but I'm okay with that. They're all games that mean a lot to me personally, and that was the whole point of this exercise, so it was pretty fun. I'm glad to have spent the time going through it. So I hope you enjoyed spending some time reminiscing with me, and I will see you later.